Alright, in this video, we are going to talk about the external features of the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, okay, and it's responsible for higher functions like thinking, perception, and voluntary movement. Okay, so this is the cerebrum, and here we have the cerebellum, and here we have the brain stem. Okay, now the cerebrum is divided into two halves. Okay, the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. Now let's look at the diagram to show the divisions. Okay, now these two halves are separated by a deep groove called the longitudinal cerebral fissure. Okay, but however, this separation is not complete, because at the base of this cerebrum, the two hemispheres are connected by a thick bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. Now, let's say we take a vertical section of this cerebrum this way, and we look at it like this. All right, so we are going to see something like this. All right, so this is a coronal section of the cerebrum. Okay, and here we can see the longitudinal median fissure or longitudinal cerebral fissure that separates the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, and at the base we have the corpus callosum, okay, that connects the two cerebral hemispheres. Now, when we look at this coronal section of the cerebrum, okay, we can see the cerebral cortex, which is the outer gray matter. All right, and it contains cell bodies of neurons. Okay, now deep to the cerebral cortex we have the white matter. Okay, so which is made up of axons that connects different parts of the brain. Okay, now we also have the basal nuclei. So the basal nuclei these are clusters of gray matter that are located within the white matter. Okay, we also have the lateral ventricle, okay, which is a cavity within the hemisphere that contains the cerebrospinal fluid. Right, so basically we've seen the components or the parts of this cerebrum. So we are going to look at them in details in future videos. But in this video, we want to talk about the external features of the cerebrum. Right, so we'll talk about the poles. Now let's talk about the poles of the hemisphere. Now each cerebral hemisphere has three ends known as poles. Okay, so first we have the frontal pole. This is the frontal pole. Okay, and we have the occipital pole. Okay, now this is the occipital pole, and we also have the temporal pole. So each cerebral hemisphere has three poles: the frontal pole, the temporal pole, and the occipital pole. Now next, we are going to talk about the surfaces of the cerebral hemisphere. Now each cerebral hemisphere has three surfaces. Now we have the superiorlateral surface. Okay, so this that we are seeing here is the superiorlateral surface. So it's a large outer curved surface. Okay, so this part is the superiorlateral surface. Okay, so we also have the medial surface. Now this part is the superiorlateral surface, and this part is the medial surface. Okay, this part is the medial surface. The medial surface is the inner surface between the two hemispheres. Okay, so lastly we also have the inferior surface. Okay, so this is the inferior surface of the cerebrum. Okay, now it's also important to note that the inferior surface is divided into two. All right, the anterior part called the orbital surface, okay, and the posterior part called the tentorial surface. Okay, So that's for the surfaces of the cerebrum. Now, the next we are going to talk about are the borders of the cerebrum. Now, each cerebral hemisphere has three main borders. Okay, three main borders. Now, firstly, we have the supromedial border. Now, let's look at a diagram to show us the supromedial border. Now, this is the supromedial border of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay. Now, the supromedial border separates the superolateral surface, okay, from the medial surface. All right. Now, we also have the inferolateral border. Now, here we can see the inferolateral border. Okay. Now, in this view of the cerebrum, we can see, the inferior surface of the cerebrum, and we can also see the medial surface. Okay. Now, this is the supromedial border. Okay. Why this is the inferolateral border? So, the inferolateral border separates the superolateral surface from the inferior surface. Okay. The inferolateral border separates the superolateral surface from the inferior surface. So this entire part is the inferolateral border. Now, it's also important to note that the anterior part, okay, now this is the anterior part. So actually this side is the anterior and this side is the posterior. Now, the anterior part of the inferolateral border is also called the superciliary border, right? And the reason is because it lies just above the eyebrows. All right. So next, we also have another border called the inferomedial border. The inferomedial border. Okay. Now this is the inferomedial border, and the inferomedial border separates the medial surface from the inferior surface. All right. It separates the medial surface from the inferior surface. Now, this inferior medial border is divided into two parts. The anterior part is called the medial orbital border, while the posterior part is called the medial occipital border. All right. So I hope the borders are clear. So right here we have the inferior lateral border. Okay, I will say the anterior part of the inferior lateral border is called the superciliary border. Okay, so we also talked about the inferior medial border. Okay, and it's further divided into two. We have the anterior part called the medial orbital border and the posterior part called the medial occipital border. Okay, so that's for the borders of the cerebrum. All right. Now, another important thing we need to note is that the surface of the cerebrum is not smooth, so it has folds. Okay, the surface of the cerebrum is not smooth; it has folds, and these folds increase the surface area of the cerebrum. Okay, so the raised folds are called the gyri. Gyri, why the grooves, okay, that suppress these folds are called the sulci. Now, we can see that there are many gyri and sulci, on the cerebrum. Okay, so but we are going to look at the major sulci, because these major sulci help us to separate the cerebrum into lobes. Okay, into four major lobes. Okay, so we have the lateral sulcus. Okay, let's look at a diagram to show us the lateral sulcus. So this is the lateral sulcus, or called Sylvian fissure. Okay, so this lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe, from the frontal lobe, and the parietal lobe. All right. So we also have the central sulcus. Now this is the central sulcus, and it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. All right. So we also have another sulcus here called the parietal occipital sulcus. You have the parietal occipital sulcus. Okay, and it basically separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. All right. So we also have an imaginary sulcus drawn from this point. This point is called the pre-occipital notch. Okay, so this pre-occipital notch, an imaginary line is drawn from here up to the parietal occipital sulcus. Okay, and it separates the occipital lobe from the temporal lobe. All right, so these are the major sulci that separates the cerebrum into lobes. So that said, we have four major lobes of the cerebrum. We have the frontal lobe, okay, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. All right, so these are the major lobes of the cerebrum. Okay, so we also have another lobe that is hidden called the insula. All right, so this lobe is located deep within the lateral sulcus. Okay, so deep within the lateral sulcus, we have the insula. All right, so these are the external features of the cerebrum. All right, so we've talked about, you know, the poles, the surfaces, and the borders and the lobes of the cerebrum. All right, so that's where we are going to stop in this video, and I hope we've understood the external features of the cerebrum. So in future videos, we're going to discuss more on the cerebrum. So thank you so much for watching, and consider subscribing if you have not, and see you in my next video. Thank you so much.